In the quiet hours when London sleeps, when the Thames flows dark and silent, past the tower's ancient stones, I find myself drawn to a story that lasts only 9 days, but echoes through centuries. It's the story of a girl who never wanted to be queen, who loved books more than crowns, who died for sins that were never truly her own. Jane Grey was 16 when they placed a crown on her head. She was 16 when they took her head from her shoulders. Between those moments lay 9 days that changed everything, and nothing 9 days when England had a queen who wished only to disappear into her books and be forgotten by history. But history doesn't forget. Not really. It just pushes some stories into the shadows, where they wait for someone to find them again. Tonight, I want to tell you about the girl who became queen for 9 days and paid for it with her life. About the child who read Greek philosophers while other girls played with dolls. About the young woman who walked to her execution with more courage than most soldiers show in battle. This is Jane's story, not the political pawn they made her into, but the person she really was when no one was watching. Jane Grey was born in 1537 into a world that was hungry for power and had no patience for dreamers. Her father, Henry Grey, was ambitious in the way that dangerous men often are, all reaching for something just beyond his grasp. Her mother, Frances, was King Henry VIII's niece, which made Jane valuable in ways that had nothing to do with who she really was. From the moment she could walk, Jane's life was planned around other people's ambitions. She would marry this prince, support that cause, be moved around like a chess piece in games she didn't understand and never wanted to play. But nobody asked Jane what she wanted. Nobody ever asked Jane anything. What Jane wanted was to be left alone with her books, while other noble children learned to dance and flirt and scheme. Jane learned Latin and Greek. While they practiced their curtsies, she practiced her philosophy. By the age of 9, she could read Plato in the original Greek. By 12, she was writing letters in perfect Latin to some of the greatest scholars in Europe. Her tutor, John Aylmer, marveled at her mind. "I have never seen such hunger for learning," he wrote to a friend. "She devours knowledge like others devour sweetcakes, always wanting more." But Jane's parents saw her intelligence as just another tool to advance their position. A learned daughter could make a better marriage, could impress the right people, could open doors that might otherwise stay closed. They pushed her harder, demanded she learn more languages, master more subjects, and become more impressive. The pushing never stopped. When Jane was slow to memorize a passage, her mother would pinch her arms until they bruised. When she showed more interest in her books than in practicing courtly graces, her father would lock her away without meals. They were making her perfect, they said. They were preparing her for greatness. But Jane didn't want greatness. She wanted quiet corners and good light for reading. She wanted conversations about ideas instead of politics. She wanted to wake up in the morning and choose her own path through the day. "Sometimes I think I was born into the wrong life," she confided to her cousin once. "I dream of being a scholar's daughter, poor but free to think my own thoughts." She found escape in her studies when the world around her became too much. The shouting, the scheming, the constant pressure to be something she wasn't. She would disappear into the works of ancient philosophers. Marcus Aurelius taught her about duty and acceptance. Plato showed her worlds of pure ideas, untainted by the messy politics of Tudor England. At 13, she was more learned than most university graduates. She could discuss theology with bishops, philosophy with scholars, history with the greatest minds of her age. But she was still a child, still a girl who sometimes cried herself to sleep because the world felt too big and too hungry for her to handle. She had no way of knowing that her education, the thing she loved most in the world, would be the chain that dragged her toward a crown she never wanted and a death she didn't deserve. In 1553, when Jane was 15, King Edward VI lay dying. He was young, only 15 himself, but he had been sickly all his life, and everyone knew the end was coming. The problem was, what would happen next? According to the law, Edward's older sister Mary should inherit the throne. But Mary was Catholic, and England had been Protestant since her father Henry VIII broke with Rome. The Protestant nobles who had grown rich and powerful under Edward's reign were terrified of what Mary might do to them. That's when John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, came up with his plan. He was the most powerful man in England, the one who really ruled while young Edward was king. And he had a son, Guildford, who needed a wife. Jane's parents smelled opportunity. Their daughter was Protestant, She was brilliant, and most importantly, she had royal blood. If they could marry her to Guildford Dudley, if they could somehow put her on the throne instead of Mary... Jane knew nothing about these plans until it was too late. One morning in May 1553, her parents told her she was to be married, not someday, not when she was old immediately. The groom was Guildford Dudley, a spoiled young man who cared more about his clothes than his books. "I don't want to marry him," Jane said. "I don't want to marry anyone yet. I'm only 15. Her mother slapped her across the face. "You'll do as you're told," she hissed. "This marriage will secure our family's future." "What about my future?" Jane asked, touching her stinging cheek. "Your future is what we make it," her father replied coldly. The wedding took place on May 25, 1553. Jane stood at the altar in a dress that felt like armor. Speaking vows she didn't mean to a boy she barely knew. She was no longer Jane Grey, the scholar. She was Lady Jane Dudley, a political piece in someone else's game. 6 weeks later, King Edward died. Jane was at Chelsea, studying quietly in the garden. When the messengers came, they knelt before her, and suddenly everyone was calling her Your Majesty and talking about processions and coronations. "There's been a mistake," Jane said, her voice small and confused. "I'm not the Queen. Princess Mary is the Queen." But there was no mistake. Edward had changed his will, cutting out his sisters and naming Jane as his heir. The Protestant lords had convinced the dying boy king that this was the only way to save England from Catholic rule. "You are our queen now," the Duke of Northumberland told her. "It is God's will." Jane fell to her knees in the garden, not in reverence, but in shock. She had been reading Cicero's letters that morning, thinking about philosophy and rhetoric. Now she was supposed to be Queen of England. "I don't want it," she whispered. "Please, I never wanted any of this." But wanting had nothing to do with it. The crown was already on her head, invisible but heavy as iron, and somewhere to the north, Princess Mary was gathering an army to take back what she believed was rightfully hers. Jane was 16 years old, and she had just become the most powerful person in England. She was also, though she didn't know it yet, a dead girl walking. The Tower of London had been home to kings and queens for centuries. It had also been their prison and their executioner. When Jane arrived there on July 10th, 1553, to await her coronation, she couldn't have known which role the tower would play in her story. At first, everything seemed possible. She was queen, the most powerful person in the realm, surrounded by servants who called her Your Majesty and nobles who bowed when she passed. But Jane had read enough history to know that power could be as dangerous as it was intoxicating. "I never wanted this crown," she told her husband, Guildford, on their first night in the royal apartments. He was sprawled across a chair, already drunk on wine and ambition. "Well, you have it now," he said, barely looking up from his cup. "And you'd better get used to it, because my father didn't go to all this trouble just to watch you mope around, feeling sorry for yourself." Jane walked to the window and looked out at London. Somewhere out there, people were probably talking about their new queen, wondering what she would be like. Whether she would be wise or foolish, kind or cruel. She wondered if they knew she was just a frightened girl who wanted nothing more than to go back to her books. The days that followed were a blur of meetings and ceremonies, of men in expensive clothes explaining things she already understood better than they did. Jane might have been young, but she wasn't stupid. She could see the fear in their eyes, hear the uncertainty in their voices when they talked about Princess Mary's growing support. "The people will accept you," the Duke of Northumberland kept saying. "You are the rightful queen, named by King Edward himself." But Jane had read enough about English history to know that rightful was often just another word for whoever could hold the throne long enough, and she was starting to understand that she might not be able to hold it at all. News from the countryside grew worse each day. Princess Mary's army was growing. Important nobles were declaring for her instead of Jane. Even some of the lords, who had originally supported Jane's claim, were beginning to waver. Jane spent her evenings alone in the royal library, reading by candlelight. She found comfort in the familiar rhythm of Latin prose, in the timeless wisdom of ancient philosophers who had faced their own impossible situations. Marcus Aurelius had been an emperor who never wanted to rule. Perhaps he would understand. "What are you reading?" Guildford asked one night, finding her hunched over a manuscript. "Boethius," Jane replied without looking up. "The Consolation of Philosophy. He wrote it while he was in prison, waiting to be executed." Guildford shuddered. "Why would you read something so morbid?" Because, Jane said quietly, I think I might need to understand how to face what's coming. On July 19, 1553, 9 days after Jane had been proclaimed queen, the Privy Council met in emergency session. When they emerged, their faces told the story before their words did. Your Majesty, the council's spokesman said, his voice shaking slightly, we have decided that Princess Mary is the rightful Queen of England. We must ask you to step down. Jane looked around the room at the men who had knelt before her. Just days earlier, now they wouldn't meet her eyes. I understand, she said simply. I never wanted the crown. I'm glad to be rid of it. But even as she spoke, Jane knew it wasn't that simple. You couldn't just try to be queen and then go back to being a normal person. Some crimes were too big to forgive, even when you never meant to commit them in the first place. That night, alone in her room, Jane wrote a letter to Princess Mary. She explained that she had never wanted the throne, that she had been forced into accepting it by others. She begged for mercy, not just for herself, but for her young husband. I know I have done wrong, she wrote, but I pray that you will remember I am but a girl who was used by others for their own purposes. She sealed the letter with wax and her own tears, and sent it off into the darkness. Then she sat by her window, watching the Thames flow past the tower, and waited to see whether mercy would come, or whether she would join the long list of people who had entered the tower as royalty and left as corpses. Mary's mercy, when it came, was conditional and cold. Jane and Guildford would live, but they would remain prisoners in the tower. They were too dangerous to release living symbols of Protestant resistance to Mary's Catholic rule, but Mary wasn't quite ready to execute a 16-year-old girl whose only crime had been obeying her elders. The royal apartments became a prison cell. Jane was allowed to keep some of her books, to write letters to her family, to walk in the tower's small garden under guard, but she was no longer a queen. Barely even a person, just a political problem that Mary didn't quite know how to solve. At first, the imprisonment wasn't so terrible. Jane had her books, her studies, the quiet routine of a scholar's life that she had always wanted. She read Plato and Aristotle, corresponded with theologians, wrote treatises on religious questions. In some ways, she was freer as a prisoner than she had ever been as a nobleman's daughter. I think I could be content here, she wrote to her old tutor, John Aylmer. If only I could forget the world outside these walls, I might find a kind of peace. But the world wouldn't let her forget. In early 1554, Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion against Queen Mary's plan to marry Philip of Spain. The rebels wanted to put Jane back on the throne, to save England from foreign Catholic rule. Jane knew nothing about the rebellion until it was over, but that didn't matter. Her very existence had inspired it, and that made her too dangerous to live there saying, I conspired with the rebels. Jane told Guildford when the news reached them. They're saying, I encouraged Wyatt to rise against the Queen. Guildford, who had grown thin and pale during their months in prison, stared at her with frightened eyes. Did you? Of course not, Jane said. I've been here the whole time. I haven't spoken to anyone outside these walls except through letters, and those were all about philosophy and religion. But explanations didn't matter anymore. Mary had decided that Jane was too dangerous to live, conspiracy or no conspiracy. The only question now was when the execution would come. On February 12, 1554, Jane was informed that she had been found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. Guildford received the same sentence. They would die together, the unwilling king and queen who had ruled England for 9 days. Jane received the news calmly. She had been expecting it for months. When she asked tomorrow morning, the tower's constable replied, his voice gentle. He had grown fond of the quiet girl who spent her days reading and never caused any trouble. That night, Jane wrote her final letters. To her sister Catherine, she gave advice about marriage and learning. To her father, she offered forgiveness for forcing her into the situation that had led to her death. To Queen Mary, she wrote one last plea, not for her own life, but for understanding. I die as I have lived, she wrote, seeking only truth and trying to serve God as best I know how. I hope that my death will be the end of this matter, and that no more blood will be shed because of what was done in my name. She spent her last hours reading the Bible and writing in her prayer book. On the final page, she wrote in Latin, if my death will give you a crown, I will willingly surrender my life. But if my death will only lead to more suffering, then I pray God will forgive those who have brought this about. As dawn broke over London, Jane Grey prepared to face the scaffold with the same courage she had once brought to her studies. She was still 16 years old. She had been queen for 9 days and a prisoner for 7 months. In a few hours, she would be nothing but a name in the history books. She was lucky enough to be remembered at all. February 13th, 1554, dawned cold and grey over London. Snow had fallen during the night, covering the tower's ancient stones with a blanket of white that would soon be stained red. Jane woke before dawn, as she had every morning of her imprisonment. But this morning was different. This morning she would not see another sunset. She dressed carefully in black, the color of mourning, of endings, of final things. Over her dress, she wore a simple white cape that made her look even younger than her 16 years. Her auburn hair was pinned up neatly, exposing the pale curve of her neck. The night before, she had asked to see Guildford one last time. They had been married for 8 months, but had barely known each other. Two young people caught up in a game neither understood. They said goodbye through the bars of their cells, their hands touching briefly through the cold iron. "I'm sorry," Guildford had whispered. "I'm sorry for all of it." "So am I," Jane had replied. "But it's too late for sorry now." On the morning of her execution, Jane could hear the sounds of Guildford's death from her window. They had decided to execute him first, on Tower Hill, in full view of the London crowds. Jane listened to the noise of the gathering crowd, the official proclamations, and finally the terrible silence that meant it was over. When they came for her, Jane was sitting at her small desk, writing a final message in her prayer book. She had been copying out verses from the Bible, finding comfort in the familiar words, even as her own words ran out. "Lady Jane," the tower's constable said gently, "it's time." Jane looked up from her writing. Her eyes were red from crying, not for herself, but for Guildford, for their families, for all the lives that had been destroyed by other people's ambitions. "I'm ready," she said. She had asked that her execution be private, away from the crowds who had gathered to watch Guildford die. Even in death, she wanted to maintain her dignity, to face the end without being turned into a spectacle for the mob. The scaffold had been built on Tower Green. Within the tower's walls, only about 150 people were there to witness her death. Officials, a few curious servants. Jane was grateful for the relative privacy. She had lived her life trying to avoid attention, and she didn't want to die as entertainment for the masses. She walked to the scaffold with steady steps, though those who watched said her face was pale as the snow beneath her feet. In her hand, she carried a small book, her prayer book, with its margins filled with her own thoughts and quotations from the philosophers she loved. At the scaffold, Jane was invited to speak. Many condemned prisoners used this moment to beg for mercy, to protest their innocence, to curse their enemies. Jane did none of these things. "I pray you all, good Christian people, to bear me witness that I die a true Christian woman," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her fear. "I do look to be saved by no other means but only by the mercy of God, in the blood of his only Son, Jesus Christ." She spoke about forgiveness, about faith, about the hope that her death would end the suffering that had begun with her unwanted coronation. She asked those present to pray for Queen Mary, to seek peace rather than revenge. "I pray God save the Queen," she concluded, and meant it. The executioner knelt before her, as was traditional, to ask her forgiveness for what he was about to do. Jane granted it gladly. "I pray you dispatch me quickly," she said. Then came the moment that would haunt the witnesses for the rest of their lives. Jane knelt at the block, but the executioner's assistant had forgotten to guide her hands to the right position. Blindfolded, she groped frantically for the block, unable to find it. "Where is it?" she cried out, her composure finally breaking. "What shall I do? Where is it?" Someone stepped forward to guide her hands to the wooden block. Jane steadied herself, placed her neck in position, and spoke her final words. "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe fell once, clean and quick. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 days queen, was dead. They buried her in the tower's chapel, in an unmarked grave next to other royal prisoners who had died for the crime of being inconvenient. Her body was wrapped in simple cloth, with no ceremony, no monument, no recognition of the brilliant mind that had been silenced forever. Snow continued to fall that afternoon, covering the bloodstains on the scaffold, making everything clean and white again. But the memory of a 16-year-old girl who had died with such dignity would linger in the tower's stones forever. In the centuries since Jane Grey died, Her story has taken on a life of its own. She became a symbol of Protestant martyrdom, of innocent youth destroyed by political ambition, of the tragedy that comes when children are used as weapons in adult wars. But these symbols, true as they might be, sometimes obscure the real person Jane was. She wasn't just a political victim or a religious martyr. She was a brilliant young woman who loved learning more than life itself, who found beauty in ancient philosophy and comfort in quiet scholarship. Today, if you visit the Tower of London, you can see the chapel where Jane is buried. There's a plaque there now, finally acknowledging her grave after centuries of anonymity. Tourists take pictures and guides tell her story to groups of schoolchildren who can barely imagine a world where a 16-year-old could be executed for political reasons. But sometimes, in the quiet hours when the crowds have gone home and the tower settles into evening silence, the guards say you can still sense her presence, not as a tragic queen or a martyred saint, but as she really was, a girl with a book in her hands, reading by candlelight, lost in worlds of ideas and imagination. They say she haunts the White Tower's library, where fragments of her writings are still kept. Visitors sometimes report seeing a young woman in Tudor dress, sitting in the corner with an open book, so absorbed in her reading that she doesn't notice she's been dead for nearly 500 years. Perhaps it's just imagination, the power of a story well told to make the past feel present. But I like to think Jane found what she was looking for in death, an eternity of quiet study, of learning without interruption, of books that never end and thoughts that never have to be hidden. Her prayer book survived, the one she carried to the scaffold. You can see it in the British Library today, its margins filled with her careful notes, her thoughts on faith and philosophy and the meaning of a life cut short. The last thing she wrote, on the morning of her execution, was a message to her sister: live still to die, that by death you may purchase eternal life. The girl who was queen for 9 days had finally found the one kingdom that could never be taken from her, the realm of memory, where her true self lives on, not as others wanted her to be, but as she really was. In the end, Jane Grey got what she always wanted: to be left alone with her books, to think her own thoughts, to exist beyond the reach of those who would use her for their own purposes. Death gave her the freedom that life never could, and in the tower's shadows, where history whispers its secrets to those who know how to listen, she reads an eternal, peaceful, and finally, truly free. I die as I have lived, seeking only truth, and trying to serve God as best I know how. Lady Jane Grey, in her final letter to Queen Mary, February 1554, if my death will give you a crown, I will willingly surrender my life. From Jane Grey's prayer book, written on the morning of her execution.